The wound should have killed him in the hallway. It did not, because of the woman with the cleaning cart. Nobody at Ashgrove Regional Medical Center knew her last name for certain. On the roster she was listed as Marta Yun, housekeeping, night shift, 7 years of service without a single incident report. She was the woman who mopped in silence, who nodded instead of speaking, who kept her grey hair pinned back so tightly it looked painful. Nurses said good morning to her the way people say good morning to furniture, out of habit rather than attention. She was, by every measure the hospital used to measure people, invisible. That invisibility was the point. Marta had built it herself, brick by careful brick, the way a demolitions expert builds a wall to hide the charge behind it. She wore soft-soled shoes that made no sound on linoleum. She kept her sleeves long even in summer, because the scars beneath them told stories she had buried in another hemisphere. She moved through the corridors of Ashgrove with the economy of someone who had once had to cross minefields, and old habits. The truly deep ones never really left the body. They only went quiet. On the night everything changed, the hospital was doing what hospitals do at 2 in the morning, breathing slow and fluorescent, the vending machines humming louder than the people. Marta was pushing her cart down the surgical wing, restocking hand sanitizer, when Dr. Elena Cho was still 40 minutes from arriving, unaware that her entire understanding of the woman with the mop was about to be rewritten in blood. Dr. Cho was Ashgrove's head of trauma surgery, 38 years old, with the kind of reputation surgeons earn only by being right when everyone else is guessing. She had trained at Walter Reed, had spent 2 years with a forward surgical team before returning stateside, and she carried that experience like a blade kept sheathed, but always oiled. She was not an antagonist. She was, in fact, the person in this story closest to the truth, and that made her the one who would notice first. But before Elena arrived, there was a corridor and a body on the floor, and a man named Ashgrove had hired 6 weeks earlier as chief of surgical operations. A man named Roland Voss. Voss had come from a private hospital chain with a talent for cutting costs and a talent for cutting nothing else. He wore suits that cost more than Marta earned in a month, and he treated the custodial staff the way some men treat weather, an inconvenience to be endured rather than a fact of life to be respected. He had already tried, twice, to have night housekeeping reduced to a skeleton crew. He had called Marta to her face, in front of 2 nurses, the mop lady, as though a name were a luxury she had not earned. It was Voss who found the collapsed man first, in the sense that he was the first administrator to arrive at the scene, though by then Marta had already been kneeling over the body for 90 seconds, and 90 seconds, in a wound like that one, was the entire war. The man on the floor was Daniel Reyes, 41, a visiting orthopedic consultant who had been walking back from the parking structure after a late consult when someone, still unidentified in that first chaotic hour, had attacked him with a blade near the loading dock and left him staggering through the automatic doors before he went down in the surgical corridor, directly in Marta's path. She heard him before she saw him. A wet, ragged exhale, the sound a body makes when it is trying to breathe around blood instead of air. She left the cart where it stood and crossed the distance at a pace that would have looked, to any camera reviewing the footage later, less like walking and more like closing. The wound was in his lower abdomen, just above the hip, a deep angled puncture that had opened something vital beneath the muscle. Blood was pulsing out of him in rhythmic surges, dark and arterial, pooling fast enough to reflect the ceiling lights. Most people, even trained people, freeze for half a second in front of a wound like that. Marta did not freeze. Her hands were already moving before her mind had finished the diagnosis, because for her the diagnosis and the response had long ago fused into a single motion. She tore his shirt open with 2 economical pulls. She did not press her palm flat against the wound the way a first aid course teaches, a method built for wounds that are polite enough to clot on their own. Instead, she drove 2 fingers directly into the wound tract at a precise angle, seeking and finding the vessel by feel, pinning it against bone the way a surgeon pins a bleeder before clamping it, and with her other hand she packed the cavity around her fingers with gauze pulled from her cart, layer after layer, tight and deliberate, the way one packs a wound meant to survive a transport under fire rather than an elevator ride to imaging. It was not first aid. It was field medicine, the kind taught only to people who had been trained to keep a man alive long enough for someone else to finish the job, in places where the someone else might be an hour away, instead of 40 feet down a corridor. Voss arrived in the middle of it, saw the housekeeper's arm buried in a stranger's abdomen, blood soaking her sleeve to the elbow, and reacted the way small men react to things they do not understand. He shouted, "Get away from him. You are contaminating the wound. You have no business touching a patient. Step back before I have you escorted out of this building." Marta did not step back. She did not even look up. Her voice, when it came, was flat and low, the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed in far worse circumstances than this one. "If I move my hand, he bleeds out in under a minute. Call the trauma team. Tell them femoral branch. Active packing in place. Do not remove until surgical control." Voss opened his mouth to argue, because arguing was the only tool in his box, and then a nurse who had come running at the noise took one look at the wound and the position of Marta's hand, and understood, in the animal part of her brain that recognizes competence even when the conscious mind has not caught up, that this woman was not the problem in the hallway. She was the only reason there was still a hallway to argue in. "Call Dr. Cho," the nurse said. Now, Elena Cho arrived at a run, scrubs half-tied, hair escaping its clip, the particular controlled panic of a surgeon who has been woken from an on-call nap into an emergency that is already 40 minutes deep. She dropped to her knees on the other side of the body and, for one professional heartbeat, simply assessed. What she saw stopped her breath in a way that had nothing to do with the blood. The packing was not amateur pressure. It was tactical wound packing, precise, layered, angled to compress against the specific structure that was bleeding, rather than mashed generally over the wound the way panicked bystanders do it. The 2 fingers pinning the vessel were positioned with an accuracy that took surgeons years to develop by feel alone. Elena had seen this exact technique exactly twice before in her career, both times performed by former combat medics who had done it under fire, in the dirt, with no other choice. "Who taught you to do this?" Elena said. Not as a question so much as a demand for the world to explain itself. Marta did not answer. Her eyes were on the monitor a nurse had wheeled over, on the numbers, on the color of the blood still weeping around the edges of her packing. She was calculating, the way she had once calculated in places where calculation was the only difference between a man living to see morning and a man not. They moved Reyes to imaging within 4 minutes, Marta walking alongside the gurney, with her hand still buried in the wound, because removing it before surgical control was ready would undo everything she had bought him. Voss trailed behind, red-faced, already composing in his head the complaint he intended to file, already certain that whatever this housekeeper had done, it constituted a liability the hospital could not afford. He had no idea yet that liability was about to become the least of his problems. Elena scrubbed in fast, and while the anesthesia team worked, she pulled up the portable scan images on the monitor beside the operating table, the quick contrast study meant to map the damage before the real cutting began. She was looking for the extent of the bleed, the involvement of the iliac vessels, the depth of penetration. What she found instead was a story written in tissue. The wound tracked on the scan showed a single, controlled entry angle, consistent with the packing Marta had performed, but it was not that which made Elena go still. It was the pattern of compression around the vessel itself, a pattern that told her the fingers pinning it had found the exact 3-centimeter window where pressure would occlude flow without crushing the vessel wall, a window most surgeons had to search for with instruments and imaging. Not fingertips, not in a hallway, not in under 2 minutes. There was something else, too, something Elena almost missed, because it was so small against the scale of the emergency. A faint, old scar of calcified tissue near Marta's own forearm, visible on the edge of the imaging field, where her arm had been braced against the patient during transport. A puckered line, unlike any surgical scar Elena had ever catalogued. It was the mark of a wound stitched in a hurry, without proper anesthesia, by someone working with limited supplies and even more limited time. Elena had seen scars like that exactly once, on a retired Army Ranger medic who had shown her his arm during a conference, and told her quietly, over 2 drinks, what field surgery actually looked like when there was no field hospital left standing. Elena looked from the scan to the wound, to the woman still standing at the edge of sterile field in her housekeeping uniform, blood drying on her sleeve, face utterly composed. And Elena Cho, head of trauma surgery, board-certified, decorated, confident in her own hands in a way few surgeons ever achieved, stepped back from the table. It was not fear. It was recognition. In 14 years of practicing medicine, Elena had learned to identify exactly one thing with total certainty: the difference between someone who had studied violence in a textbook and someone who had survived it in the flesh. Every instinct honed by every trauma she had ever walked into told her that the woman standing across from her had done this before, not in a simulation lab, not in a classroom, but in conditions where the next mistake was not a malpractice suit. It was a body bag. "You've done this in the field," Elena said. Not a question this time. A statement offered like a hand extended across a gap neither of them had expected to need to cross. Marta's eyes, for the first time that night, met hers directly. Something passed behind them, brief and heavy, the shadow of years compressed into a glance. "Once or twice," she said. "I need you scrubbed in," Elena said, already turning to the surgical nurse. "Get her gowned. Now, she's not leaving this table until we have surgical control, and I want her hands where they are until I tell her otherwise." This was the moment the entire operating theater tilted on its axis, the moment a housekeeper became, in the eyes of everyone present, something closer to a colleague than staff, though none of them yet understood how far that word fell short of the truth. Voss, watching through the observation window, because his rank permitted him to watch even when it did not permit him to help, could not accept what he was seeing. He pushed the intercom button with the flat of his palm. "This is a massive liability breach," he said, his voice cracking through the speaker into the sterile field like static. "That woman is not credentialed. If anything happens on this table, it is on this hospital's head, Dr. Cho, and I am formally objecting." Elena did not even look up from the field. "Note the objection," she said. "Now be quiet, or leave the window." Under the lights, hands gloved, gowned in sterile blue that did nothing to hide the calm authority radiating off her, Marta worked alongside Elena the way two instruments in the same orchestra find the same rhythm without needing to be told the tempo. When Elena called for exposure, Marta's hand was already retracting tissue at the correct angle before the word finished leaving Elena's mouth. When the bleeding threatened to obscure the field, Marta suctioned with a precision that came not from hospital training, but from something older. Something learned when the suction unit had been a hand and a rag, and the surgeon had been whoever was left standing. "Clamp," Elena said. "Already have traction on the proximal end," Marta answered, and she did, her fingers holding tension on a vessel that would have slipped from a less experienced grip, giving Elena the half-second she needed to place the instrument cleanly. It went on like that for 11 minutes, a silent conversation of hands and instruments, until the bleeding stopped, truly stopped. The monitor's rhythm settling into something steady and survivable. Reyes would live. Everyone in that room understood, with the particular clarity that only comes after a crisis has passed, that he would live because two women had refused to accept that he would not, one of them credentialed by a medical board, the other credentialed by something the medical board had no forms for. Word moved through Ashgrove the way water moves through cracked concrete, finding every gap, reaching every level within the hour. By the time the sun rose, half the hospital staff had heard some version of the story, most of it wrong in the details, and right in the shape. The housekeeper who saved a man's life with her bare hands, the surgeon who stepped back and let her work. Voss, humiliated in front of his own operating theatre, and unwilling to let the humiliation stand, did what small men in positions of temporary power always do. He escalated in the wrong direction. He filed a formal incident report demanding Marta's immediate suspension pending investigation, citing unauthorized medical intervention, breach of sterile protocol, and endangerment of a patient by an unlicensed individual. He drafted it before his coffee had gone cold, and he sent it not just to Human Resources, but, in a move meant to protect himself from any accusation of favoritism, to the Regional Health Authority, and, because he liked the sound of thoroughness, to the State Medical Board. It would prove to be the single worst professional decision of his career, though he did not know that yet, standing in his office, admiring his own decisiveness in the mirror of his phone screen. Marta was called into a small conference room 2 days later, still in her housekeeping uniform, because no one had told her to wear anything else. Seated across from a panel that included the hospital's chief administrator, a representative from the medical board, and Voss himself, arms crossed, chin lifted with the satisfaction of a man who believes the paperwork has already won the argument for him. "Miss Yun," the administrator began, uncomfortable, glancing at notes he clearly wished someone else had written. "There are concerns about the nature of your intervention. While the outcome was positive, hospital policy is explicit about the boundaries of unlicensed staff during a medical emergency." Voss leaned forward before anyone else could speak. "Let's be honest about what happened here." A member of housekeeping staff, in a moment of panic, got lucky. We cannot build hospital policy around luck. If she had done something wrong, if she had ruptured that vessel further, we would be having a very different conversation. One involving lawyers instead of committees. Marta said nothing for a long moment. She looked at her own hands, folded on the table. Hands that had been steady inside a man's abdomen while this man had been shouting from a safe distance. It was not luck, she said finally, quietly. The words landing with more weight than their volume suggested they should carry. Luck does not know the difference between a femoral branch and a profunda. Luck does not pack a wound at the angle that keeps a vessel from collapsing under its own clot. I have done this before, in places where the nearest surgeon was 6 hours out by helicopter, if the helicopter came at all. Voss laughed, a short, ugly sound. And where, exactly, was that? A war zone, I suppose. Forgive me if I find that difficult to believe from a woman who mops our floors for a living. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet right before something changes shape. At that exact moment, the conference room door opened without a knock, and the air in the room altered before anyone had even turned to look. The way air alters before a storm makes landfall. The man who entered wore the uniform of a lieutenant general, and behind him came 2 aides who positioned themselves at the door like men accustomed to guarding thresholds that mattered. He was broad, grey-haired, with the kind of bearing that made every other person in the room, including Voss, instinctively straighten their spine. I apologize for the interruption, the general said, and his voice filled the small room the way a voice fills a much larger space, booming without shouting, the natural authority of a man who had spent 30 years being obeyed. I was told there was a disciplinary hearing underway regarding one of my former operators. I would like to correct some misunderstandings before this goes any further. The administrator half rose from his chair. General, I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand. This is a hospital personnel matter. It stopped being purely a hospital matter, the general said, the moment someone decided to formally investigate Master Sergeant Marta Yoon, United States Army, retired, for saving a man's life using techniques she was trained by this country to use in exactly this kind of crisis. Voss's face went the color of old paper. Master Sergeant, he repeated, as though the words had teeth. 18 years of service, the general said, walking to stand behind Marta's chair, one hand resting briefly, respectfully, on its back, the gesture of a man acknowledging someone he considered, in every way that mattered, a peer, rather than a subordinate. Combat medic, attached to a special operations surgical team. 3 deployments. She stabilized more casualties in the field than most trauma centers see in a decade, often under fire, often with nothing but a med bag, and her own 2 hands standing between a soldier and a body bag. In her final deployment, she held a forward position for 6 hours after her surgical team was ambushed, keeping 2 critically wounded operators alive with field expedients most surgeons would call impossible, until extraction arrived. One of those operators was my son. The room did not breathe. She was offered a medal, the general continued, and declined it, because she said the men who did not come home deserved the ceremony more than she did. She left the service quietly, by her own choice, and asked to disappear into ordinary life, because ordinary life was the one thing the war had never let her have. I have spent 3 years trying to locate her, to properly thank her for what she did for my family. I found her, this week, because a hospital administrator decided to file a formal complaint against her to the state medical board. A complaint that quite helpfully included her full legal name. Voss's mouth opened and closed without producing sound, a man discovering in real time that the ground he had been standing on had never been ground at all. "Mr. Voss," the general said, turning toward him with the calm, terrible patience of someone who has faced far worse men than a hospital administrator and found them all, eventually, equally small. "You called this woman lucky. You suggested her competence in a life-or-death emergency was an accident. I would remind you that the only accident in this room is the one where a man with no experience of actual crisis was allowed to sit in judgment of a woman who has spent her career making sure other people's worst days did not become their last." The chief administrator, sensing with the instinct of the professionally self-preserving exactly which way this current was flowing, closed the folder in front of him with a soft, final sound. "General, on behalf of Ashgrove Regional, I want to apologize. This complaint will be withdrawn immediately, and effective today, Mrs. Yoon will be reinstated with our full and public gratitude, along with a formal commendation for her actions. It's Master Sergeant Yoon, if we're using titles," the general said mildly, though I suspect she'd rather we didn't. Marta, for the first time since entering the room, allowed something like a small, tired smile to touch the corner of her mouth. "I would," she confirmed. "Marta is fine." Voss did not survive the week in his position. It emerged, in the days that followed, that his complaint, filed in such haste and forwarded to so many external bodies, had triggered a review not just of his conduct toward Marta, but of his broader record at Ashgrove, the cost-cutting measures that had left night shifts dangerously thin. The two prior incidents where his dismissiveness toward staff concerns had contributed to preventable errors. The hospital board, eager to distance itself publicly from a man who had just been corrected by a lieutenant general in front of witnesses, terminated his contract within the week, citing conduct unbecoming of hospital leadership. He left the building the way he had entered it 6 weeks earlier, in an expensive suit, except this time no one held the door. Dr. Elena Cho, for her part, requested something unusual through official channels in the weeks that followed. She asked that Marta be permitted to assist in training the hospital's trauma response team in advanced field hemorrhage control, a request the administration, still glowing with the reflected credibility of the general's visit, approved without hesitation. It was, Elena said later, the least the hospital could do for a woman who had quietly been saving lives inside its walls long before anyone thought to ask what she had done before she picked up a mop. Daniel Reyes recovered fully. He returned to Ashgrove 3 weeks after the attack, walking slower than before but walking, and asked specifically to meet the woman who had knelt over him in that corridor. He found her restocking a supply closet on the 3rd floor, and he simply stood in the doorway for a moment, unable to find words adequate to the size of the debt. "You didn't know me," he said finally. "You didn't know if I was worth the risk." Marta looked at him with the same steady calm she had carried into every crisis of her adult life. "Everyone is worth the risk," she said. "That was never the question I was answering." In the months after, the hospital quietly changed its emergency response protocols to include hemorrhage control training for all staff, regardless of title, a policy that would later be credited with saving at least 2 more lives before the year was out. Marta kept her job in housekeeping by her own choice, though she now spent 2 shifts a week in the simulation lab teaching surgical residents the kind of technique no textbook had ever properly captured. Because it had been written not in ink, but in scar tissue, She never wore the commendation the hospital pinned to her file. She never spoke of the deployment, where she had held that position for 6 hours, not even when residents asked, wide-eyed, hoping for a war story. She simply told them what mattered. Pressure in the right place, at the right angle, held with a steady hand and a calm mind, could hold back the end of the world for exactly as long as it needed to be held back. That was the whole of it. That was enough. What the story of Marta Yoon offers, in the end, is not really a story about a housekeeper or a surgeon, or even a general standing in a small conference room, delivering judgment like a verdict from a higher court. It is a reminder that the people we walk past every day, the ones in uniforms that make them invisible, the ones who mop the floors we bleed on, may be carrying entire histories of quiet heroism that the world has trained us not to look for. Competence does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply waits by the cart, in soft-soled shoes, until the moment it is needed. And then it moves faster than anyone thought it could. If this story moved you, take a moment to hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need a reminder that heroes rarely look the way we expect them to. Share this with someone who could use a story about being underestimated and proven right. Subscribe to our channel if you want more stories like Marta's, ordinary faces hiding extraordinary pasts. And before you go, drop a comment below and tell us, have you ever misjudged someone by the uniform they wore, only to be humbled by who they really were underneath it? We will see you in the next story. There was a detail from that night in the corridor that never made it into any official report, because Elena Cho never wrote it down, and Marta never spoke of it, and Voss, in his hurried complaint, had been too blinded by procedure to notice it at all. It was the sound Marta had made in the half-second before she reached Daniel Reyes on the floor. Not a gasp. Not a cry for help. A single, low exhale through the nose, the kind of breath a soldier takes before stepping through a doorway that might be rigged. A breath that says the body has already decided what it is going to do, and the mind is simply catching up. Elena remembered that exhale for weeks afterward, turning it over in her thoughts during quiet moments in the surgeon's lounge, because she recognized it. She had made that same sound herself, once at a forward base in a country she still could not name in casual conversation, and she had never expected to hear its echo in a hospital corridor from a woman with a mop bucket. In the weeks following Voss's departure, Ashgrove Regional underwent a kind of quiet reckoning that never made the local news, though perhaps it should have. The board commissioned an internal review of staffing decisions made under his leadership, and what it found was not merely one arrogant man making one cruel remark to a woman who did not deserve it. It found a pattern, an entire administrative philosophy that treated the invisible workers of the hospital, the housekeepers, the orderlies, the overnight security staff, as expenses to be trimmed rather than as the quiet infrastructure holding the building together. 2 other employees came forward once they saw that speaking up had not ended in ruin for Marta, describing similar treatment, similar dismissals of concerns that later proved costly. The review did what reviews rarely do. It resulted in actual change, actual policy. Actual money moved from executive bonuses into night shift staffing. Elena requested a private meeting with Marta some months later, not in a conference room this time, but in the small courtyard behind the East Wing, where the hospital kept a few battered picnic tables for staff who needed 5 minutes of sky between traumas. She brought 2 coffees and did not touch hers for a long time. "I want to understand something," Elena said. "That night, when I stepped back from the table and let you work. Most surgeons I know would never have done that. Not because of ego. Because we're trained never to hand off control mid-crisis, no matter who's in front of us. Why did you think I would?" Marta considered the question the way she considered everything. Slowly, with the full weight of her attention, rather than the reflexive half-attention most people gave to conversation. "Because you looked at the scan before you looked at me," she said. "You trusted the evidence over your assumptions. Most people do it backward. They decide who someone is first, and then they interpret everything after through that decision. You didn't do that. That's rare. That's the whole difference between a good surgeon and a great one, and it's the same difference between a good officer and one who gets people killed." Elena absorbed that in silence, turning her coffee cup slowly on the table, watching a groundskeeper trim the hedge along the courtyard wall with the unhurried patience of someone who had never had to move fast for anything in his life. It struck her, in that moment, how strange and enormous the hospital was, how many quiet histories moved through its corridors every single day, invisible until the exact instant they were not. "Will you tell me about him?" Elena asked eventually. "The general's son. What happened out there?" Marta was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Elena wondered if she had overstepped. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped into a register Elena had not heard from her before, something worn smooth by retelling it only ever to herself, in the small hours when sleep would not come. "The convoy was hit twice," Marta said. "Once on the approach, once during extraction. Our surgical team lost 2 people in the first 10 minutes. I had a soldier bleeding out from a junctional wound, no proper tourniquet point, and another with a chest that was filling faster than I could relieve it, and I had a folding table, a headlamp, and whatever was still in my pack after the second hit. 6 hours is a long time to keep 2 men alive with your hands and your voice and nothing else. I don't recommend it. I don't talk about it, because talking about it doesn't change what it cost. And it doesn't bring back the ones who didn't make it through those 6 hours with us." Elena did not offer sympathy, because she understood, from her own fragments of experience overseas, that sympathy was not what was being asked for. She simply nodded, once, the way one professional acknowledges another's account of a debt paid in full. "For what it's worth," Elena said, "Reyes named his daughter after you. Middle name. He didn't ask permission. He just did it and told me to tell you when I saw you next." Something moved behind Marta's eyes then, brief and unguarded, the closest thing to visible emotion Elena had seen from her in the entire acquaintance. She said nothing, but she did not need to. Some debts, once acknowledged, do not require further words to be settled.